Nations and borders, these most basic facts of politics, are also in some ways the most controversial. The sources of Western tradition sacralized the border, made holy the dividing line. But the aesthetics, we might say the political aesthetics of nationhood, the admiration for collective identities grounded in their own traditions as the building block for world order, this is largely lost to mainstream discourse. In this video, I want to briefly look at the pre-modern, specifically Western conception of nation as sacred reality. We can start with Plato's account of the origin of nations in Critias. Quote, "At one time the gods received their due portions over the entire earth, region by region, and without strife. As they received what was naturally theirs in the allotment of justice, they began to settle their lands. They did not compel us by exerting bodily force on our bodies, but rather applying to the soul the rudder of persuasion. As the gods received their various regions lot by lot, they began to improve their possessions." End quote. In the laws, he specifies that it was Kronos who appointed gods to rule over different human realms. Plato's account in Critias and the laws is essentially the same thing we find in the Bible. Quote, "When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of El." End quote. The same term, sons of El, sons of God, is often translated as angels of God in the Greek Septuagint. In any case, these sons of El, or angels, are Plato's gods, and Plato's Kronos is the Bible's El. Although Plato's language of gods receiving their allotment peacefully, not as a matter of conflict, but as flowing from divine creativity, also very closely parallels what you find in the Book of Jubilees about the grandsons of Noah receiving their regions of the earth by lot and then going off to populate it. Importantly, these nations mentioned in Jubilees partly correspond to existing nations in antiquity and indeed into the modern era as well. And so, since the events of Genesis 10 precede the Tower of Babel, it would seem that the confusion of tongues at Babel was in part a return to the previous order. National diversity isn't merely a punishment, but again, the proper order of things. In the Greek sphere, the idea that division is divinely ordained precedes Plato and is really basic to the Hellenic understanding. Herodotus's histories, for example, can be read as drawing, quote, "systematic attention to proper realms," as Donald Latoner puts it in the historical method of Herodotus. As an example, we have the curious anecdote of the oracle of the god Ammon in Egypt determining the proper limits of Egyptian nationhood based on geography, where geography becomes providential. Quote, "The men of the cities of Marea and Apis, in the part of Egypt bordering Libya, believing themselves to be Libyans and not Egyptians, and disliking the injunction of the religious law that forbade them to eat cow's meat, sent to Ammon, saying that they had no part of or lot with Egypt, for they lived, they said, outside the delta and did not consent to the ways of its people, and they wished to be allowed to eat all foods. But the god forbade them. All the land, he said, watered by the Nile in its course, was Egypt. Such was the oracle given to them." End quote. It's sacred geography. We don't have this idea of theo-geographers determining the spiritual limits of nations anymore, but it wasn't a strange way to think about it for the ancients. We can read other sources on geographic limits having spiritual significance. Plato talks about Zeus appointing Aeacus to judge European souls and Rhadamanthus for Asian ones. You have the Homeric hymn to Apollo ascribing Europe, the northern Mediterranean coast, plus the Greek islands, and anything sprawling north from there to the god Apollo, for example. The principle of not going beyond wholesome limits comes through in the criticism of Persian expansion as well in Herodotus and Plato. It's prominent in Persians by Aeschylus. Plato's political project, in fact, most clearly articulated in his final and most mature work, The Laws, that I've already quoted from, is precisely prompted by, is a reaction against, the transgression of proper boundaries and the destruction of particular identities experienced in the wake of Persian expansion. We may say of the divine order established by Kronos. From The Laws, quote, had not the bondage that threatened her been warded off by the concerted policy of the Athenians and Lacedaemonians, the Spartans, practically all the Greek tribes would have been confused together by now, and barbarians confused with Greeks and Greeks with barbarians, just as the tribes, the nations, under the Persian Empire today are either scattered abroad or jumbled together and live in a miserable plight." End quote. The Greek Federation, as we might describe it, which Plato is recommending in the Laws, is a kind of virtuous counterpart to the Persian Empire as the Greeks encountered it, a way to avoid being scattered abroad or jumbled together, but still drawing together, making use of economies of scale without effacing the proper scale of locality and its cultural integrity. Imperial federation or imperium versus imperialism, we could say. We could be tempted to take this understanding as a static one, where humanity remains divided and sealed off, but that's not the case. Apart from defending the colonization of empty or sparsely populated land, which you find all over these sources, Plato is all about articulating grander political unities based on more ancient ties. Since there is such a thing as Greeks, who at some point expanded out, they should kind of return to themselves, have a centripetal motion after the centrifugal one, by articulating common political institutions, where the city-states maintain their integrity, but there are certain shared structures which you need in order to fend off future imperial expansion from foreign rivals. Eric Voegelin describes the approach of the Laws as follows, quote, "The course of history must be understood as an advance of civilization in time through inventions and arts, improvement of transportation and discoveries, population increase and density of settlement to the point when culturally homogeneous peoples in contiguous settlement appear as distinguishable units in history." End quote. And then again, quote, "A spiritually satisfactory order is possible only if the unit in question is indeed culturally an ethnos and not a jumble of former peoples held together by a conquering power, as in the Persian case. The population of a multi-civilizational ecumenic empire is not an ethnos that could organize itself as a federation of paradigmatic polis, or polity, political entity." End quote. And this is fundamentally pluralistic. Voegelin sees Plato as acknowledging the plurality of parallel civilizations in the field of history, as he puts it. So you should build grander unities on the basis of something which you share already, and then associate with others from that coherent basis, rather than conquering and destroying the local identity. If we turn to European Christendom, which draws on biblical and Greek philosophical sources, we find early thinkers like Saint Dionysus the Areopagite, Pseudo-Dionysus, or Saint Maximus, arguing that every nation has its own specific character as representing some angel, let's say some archetype, in line with Deuteronomy, where the pagan mistake was to worship these instead of God. The earthly manifestation of that angel becomes corrupted or substituted by some demon as a consequence, and where biblical language concerning Israel being God's own portion of the earth, in Deuteronomy 32, simply refers to Israel being held to the worship of the one God by her prophets, but still having a specific angel that defines that nation's character the way other nations do. The prophet Daniel talks about the princes of Persia and Greece, and Israel also having a prince, namely the archangel Michael. Saint Dionysus argues that every nation, by virtue of being a nation, has to have some angelic, some archetypal character that it's manifesting as a human collective. These are the terms in which I would put it, but you belong to God insofar as you only worship the one source. Thus are the nations punished and then healed and redeemed in Revelation 21 and 22 in John's Apocalypse at the very end there. Rather than being replaced by a single new community, the nations are brought in as the constituents of the church. The church is imagined as a federation of blessed nations in Scripture, ultimately. And I've made a video about that before. The whole chain of being is valued as beautiful and transformed. It's not abolished. In the Christian narrative, ultimately, the angelic function is occupied by a human, right? You have patron saints over nations and other collectivities. Now, it is true that some early Christians did think that Israel had no angel, and therefore, in entering the worship of the one true God, all the angels are abolished and replaced by Christ, and that this would have a specific political consequence, namely one state, one language over all humanity, no more nations of any kind. So you get some of that in Origen of Alexandria. We could say that even at the very beginning, you have a Christianity as globalism versus a Christianity allowing, quote, nationalism, to use anachronistic, provocative terms. Biblical and Platonic ideas would continue to condition European political theory. You have St. Thomas Aquinas discussing the conditions placed on different groups entering Israel based on their ancestry in Deuteronomy as a principle applicable to Christian nations as well, arguing elsewhere that, quote, likeness properly speaking is a cause of love, end quote. We could say Greek philia, or brotherly love between people, kinship, common ancestry, as distinct from erotic love between spouses, which is something specific, caritas, charitable love for those in need, agape, universal love for all humanity, and so on. So there's different types of love and an order of love, ordo amoris, where agape, universal love, for example, does not abolish philia, brotherly or kinship love, which I think is the mistake that you often find. In terms of the underlying philosophical or metaphysical basis for all this, it's pretty simple. The idea is that you can't have a general principle, a universal concept, appear in definite forms that aren't separate from each other. The definition of a circle requires that any particular circle that I encounter in the world conform to it by being discontinuous from other circles. If many circles are physically continuous with each other, their outlines would no longer be that of a circle. But we benefit from perceiving diverse circles in the world because that way we understand that the universal shape, the concept of a circle, is other than the substance and size, the particular character of these or those particular circles that we are encountering. So diversity is good. It actually leads us to understanding transcendent and universal things. Arthur Lovejoy's The Great Chain of Being is the best book on this topic. Lovejoy summarizes the point as follows, quote, a universe that is full, in the sense of exhibiting the maximal diversity of kinds, must be chiefly full of leaps. There is at every point an abrupt passage to something different, end quote. Reality has joints to it and borders where one thing stops and another thing starts. This is absolutely basic. You have to have limits, you have to have borders, you have to have definite characters. I'm not a Thomist, but St. Thomas Aquinas puts it beautifully at one point, quote, creatures cannot attain to any perfect likeness of God so long as they are confined to one species of creature. So part of the iconic function of nature to represent God's transcendent unity through the harmony of different forms, each one being a whole in itself, requires that they be different. St. Thomas continues, quote, multiplicity therefore and variety was needful in the creation. The multiplication of species is a greater addition to the good of the universe than the multiplication of individuals of a single species. The perfection of the universe, therefore, requires not only a multitude of individuals, but also diverse kinds, and therefore diverse grades of things, end quote. So you have to have different types of things in the world. Not just different individuals, but different nations and even different species, etc. No one thing can exhaust the absolute unitary creative source of all things, but they have to each express that unity by being a unity in themselves, by being coherent in themselves. The insight that any universal principle, from a shape to the human condition, is best understood if instantiated in diverse manifestations, and that the ultimate transcendent unity, the necessary being of philosophers, expresses itself its unity through a multiplicity of created unities. More specifically, that the divine source intends for there to be diversity, and that includes a diversity of human nations, is explicitly stated throughout traditions, from the ancient Egyptian Atum hymn to the Quran to modern Native American figures like the Catholic Lakota medicine man Black Elk and his visions. So it's really a widespread theological understanding of things. The love of sharp lines, of distinct characteristics, the love of difference, strong personalities, strong borders, the ethos according to which tall fences make good neighbors, this kind of idea where each one can develop a project, an aesthetic, within a grander harmony that does not efface one's particularity, is largely anathema to a lot of modern politics. And I think the two symbols that you get in the Bible, but in other traditions too, there's equivalence, but in the Bible you get these two very stark symbols for this. One is the Tower of Babel, so maiming, mutilating all difference into one uniform whole. That's the sort of masculine perversion towards uniformity. And then at the end of the Bible, that's in Genesis, and then at the end of the Bible, in the Apocalypse, you get the cup of Babylon. Not mutilating, but melting all difference in this cup, right? That's the feminine perversion towards uniformity. A proper balance allows for distinction, wholeness within harmony, coherence within community. But the symbols of Babel and Babylon, of tower and cup, show us how when the energies of the male and the female are out of sync, you get these drives towards destroying specificity. So I do think that there's something very virtuous about the aesthetic love for strong borders, strong nations, etc. Also on a spiritual level. And again, this doesn't mean you have these perfectly siphoned off, hermetically sealed units. There's always back and forth. There's always porosity and gray areas and all the rest of it. That's fine. That's part of the beauty of it. But you do have definite characters that have the right to preserve themselves over time. That's the key. Okay, as always, there's links in the description to ways to contribute to the channel. Buy me a coffee, Substack. I'm going to make a Patreon soon. Social media links as well. I'm backing these videos up on my Rumble. That's it. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time.